This ID expired in 1994. The officer smirked and held up the battered military card between two fingers, as if it were a joke. The older man standing before him said nothing. He just stood there, with silent patience. The young lieutenant chimed in. His tone was casual, but mocking. "So, you want access to the base, old man? Then you must be a real soldier, right?" But only moments later, the phone at the checkpoint rang sharply. A voice on the other end delivered a single, clipped sentence. One that changed everything. "You're dealing with the former commander of Bravo Team, Special Forces." None of the soldiers on duty had realized whom they had just turned away. Walter Kane, around 80 years old, moved with the careful, deliberate manner of a man who knew that rushing rarely led to better outcomes. His frame was lean, but sturdy. He wore plain but impeccably kept clothes. Pressed khaki trousers, a simple blue button-down shirt, and a worn brown jacket that had clearly seen many seasons. Despite his age, he stood with a straight back, a posture only decades of military discipline could teach. On this brisk morning of Veterans Day, Kane had made his way to the main gate of Camp Brighton, an army base nestled in the sun-scorched desert of Nevada. The base was holding its annual memorial ceremony, an event Kane had never attended in all these years, even though he lived just 30 miles away. For the past 40 years, in his right hand, he carried two things: an old military ID, so worn that the edges curled like the pages of a beloved old book, and a stiff envelope, sealed with official-looking government tape. His face was expressionless and unreadable as he approached the checkpoint, his eyes focused straight ahead, his steps calm and steady. "Good morning," Kane said softly to the guard. His voice was gentle, but clear. "I'd like to visit the memorial on base." Lieutenant Kevin Brooks, a 26-year-old officer, in charge of the gate that day, reached for Kane's ID. Young, ambitious, and to be honest, a bit bored with gate duty, Brooks had only been stationed at Camp Brighton for a few months. He took the card and instantly noticed how old it looked. The text was faded, barely legible. "Sir, this ID expired in 1994, Brooks said, squinting at the worn-out print. A smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth as he held the card up higher, so the others could see. "You don't seriously think this is still valid, do you?" Kane stood silently. His weathered features showed no anger, no shame, just a deep, patient tiredness that seemed to settle in his very bones. "We see this all the time," called out Sergeant Daniel Ortiz, another guard who had wandered over from a nearby post. Broad-shouldered like a football player, with a voice that boomed across the entire checkpoint, Ortiz added with a mocking tone, "Old men who think they can get through with expired IDs or fake papers." Still silent, Kane politely extended his hand to take back his ID. Brooks snickered under his breath. "If you want to get on a military base, you need valid documents," he continued condescendingly. "You've got to be a real soldier, not someone with an old card and a couple of stories." By now, a small crowd of guards and staff had gathered, drawn in by the noise and Ortiz's loud commentary. Most wore amused expressions. Some looked uncomfortable, but none said a word. Kane gave a small nod, placed both the ID and the envelope back into his jacket, and turned to leave. His movements were slow but steady, unbothered but purposeful. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply accepted their judgment and began the long walk back to the public parking lot, quietly disappearing from view as the guards returned to their posts. These were men who had survived the Cold War and Vietnam, men who didn't need to raise their voices to command respect. Kane's presence reminded Jason of those stories. And it unsettled him. How easily the others had dismissed him. As the guards returned to their posts, Jason quietly slipped into the back room. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. His uncle, Robert "Bob" Taylor, worked in personnel at the Pentagon. Maybe he could make sense of what Jason had just witnessed. "Hey, Uncle Bob, it's me, Jason." "Yeah, I'm good. Listen, something weird just happened." An old man came to the gate with a military ID. From the 90s. Most of the guys laughed at him. But I don't know. Something about him didn't sit right with me. He didn't act like the homeless vets we sometimes run into. He was different. "Could you run a name for me?" "Walter Kane. Probably enlisted sometime in the 70s, maybe even earlier." As Jason ended the call, he glanced out through the narrow window. Kane hadn't gone far. He was sitting quietly on a bench, just outside the gate. He didn't leave. He didn't make a scene. He simply waited, with a patience that felt both timeless and impossibly heavy. Jason whispered an old line his father used to drill into him. "When everyone turns away, only your conscience remains." He repeated it, slower this time, feeling its weight settle into him. The story of the incident at the gate spread through the morning shift at Camp Brighton, faster than spilled coffee on the mess hall floor. In the cafeteria, Annie Delgado, who had worked behind the counter for over 30 years, overheard a group of guards laughing as they picked up their morning coffee. "What did he look like?" Annie asked casually, wiping her hands on her apron. "Old dried-up guy." One of the guards replied between chuckles. "Maybe 80. Stood there stiff as a damn lamppost. Had an ID from 99. Can you believe that?" Annie's smile vanished. "Was he wearing a brown jacket?" "Quiet. Didn't argue." "Yeah," the guard confirmed, now a bit puzzled. "You know him?" Annie nodded slowly, a memory settling over her, like an old, familiar coat. "I saw him once, back in 1989. There was a fire in the weapons depot. 3 men were trapped inside. He just walked into the smoke, dragged them out one by one, like it was nothing. I never got his name," she added softly. "But that face. I never forgot that face." The guard raised an eyebrow, skepticism written all over his face. "Come on, Annie. If that's true, he's a damn hero." "Heroes don't get turned away at the gate," one guard muttered. Annie just shrugged, a small, sad smile on her lips. "I only told you what I saw. If you don't believe me, ask Colonel Mitchell Grant. He was one of the men pulled from the fire that night." As the morning went on, the rumors spread like wildfire. A young communications officer, who had overheard Annie's story, snapped a grainy photo of Kane, sitting quietly on the bench outside the gate. She posted it on the internal message board of the base. "Does anyone know this veteran? Turned away at the gate. But Annie says he saved lives during the 1989 depot fire." The responses came in almost immediately. Someone wrote, "Looks like the guy in that old photo in Colonel Grant's office." Another added, "My dad served in the 70s. Says that might be Walter Kane. But I thought he died years ago." A third chimed in, "Wasn't Walter Kane the one who received some classified medal in Vietnam?" Meanwhile, Jason Rivera sat nervously beside the duty phone. 20 minutes after his call to the Pentagon, the phone rang, loud and sharp. Jason snatched it up. "Private Rivera speaking." A calm, authoritative voice answered. "This is Colonel Samuel Hayes. From the Pentagon. I need to speak to the senior officer. At your checkpoint. Immediately. Put me on speaker." Jason's pulse quickened. as he waved over Lieutenant Brooks. "Sir, call from the Pentagon. They want to speak to you." Brooks straightened his uniform, confused, before taking the handset. "This is Lieutenant Brooks," he said. "Lieutenant, this is Colonel Samuel Hayes, from the Department of Historical Special Operations. Put this call on speaker, now." Brooks obeyed. The small security room went dead silent, as Hayes's voice filled the air. "The man you turned away is retired Colonel Walter E. Kane, former commander of the Bravo Special Operations Team. From 1971 to 1999. His clearance, per General Order 117, is still active, regardless of what the date on his ID says." Sergeant Ortiz, who had been leaning against the wall, snapped to attention. Lieutenant Brooks turned pale. "Yes, sir, we didn't know." Brooks stammered, but Hayes cut him off. "Colonel Kane is here to attend the annual memorial ceremony. He has every right to be there. This man led the most successful extraction unit in Vietnam. He later commanded the Cambodia POW rescue mission in 1975. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The Cambodia mission was the stuff of legends. Rumors had circled for decades about a small team that rescued 28 American prisoners of war from deep behind enemy lines, without a single casualty. A vehicle is already en route to your location." Hayes continued sternly. "I strongly suggest you treat Colonel Kane with the respect he's earned until it arrives." Almost on cue, a black military SUV rolled up to the gate. 3 high-ranking officers stepped out, their movements sharp and purposeful. Leading them was a decorated colonel, his chest a wall of campaign ribbons. "I'm Colonel Beckett," he barked. "Where is Walter Kane?" Brooks silently pointed to the bench outside. Without hesitation, Beckett marched over to Kane. The others followed closely behind. Jason stepped up to the window and watched as Beckett stood before Kane and snapped a salute. Kane stood slowly, with calm precision, and returned the salute. Words were exchanged, hands shaken. Then Kane reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, handing it carefully to Beckett. 15 minutes later, Kane and the officers returned to the gate. This time, Lieutenant Brooks and Sergeant Ortiz stood at full attention. "These men are entering the base under my authority," Beckett announced, his tone brooking no argument. As he passed through the gate, he paused and turned to the security team. "For your information," he said coolly, "that ID you mocked? It contains an embedded transmitter. Colonel Kane activates it once a year, on Veterans Day. So we know he's still out there. And we track it. Intentionally." Brooks swallowed hard. "Sir, I had no idea." "No," Beckett shot back. "You didn't. You saw an old man with a faded ID, and made assumptions. This man ran operations you'll never be cleared to read about. He saved more American lives than anyone standing at this checkpoint." As the group disappeared from sight, Jason turned to Brooks. "Sir, what just happened?" Brooks ran a tired hand across his face. "We just insulted a living legend. That's what just happened." They had survived the Cold War and Vietnam. Men who didn't need to raise their voices to command respect. Kane's presence reminded him of those stories, and it unsettled him. How easily the others had dismissed him. When the guards returned to their duties, Jason quietly slipped into the back room, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number he knew well. His uncle, Robert "Bob" Taylor, worked in the Pentagon's personnel office. Maybe he could make sense of what Jason had just experienced. "Hey Uncle Bob, it's Jason." "Yeah, I'm fine. Listen, something weird just happened." An old man tried to get onto the base with a military ID from the 90s. Most people laughed him off, but I don't know. Something about him made me pause. He wasn't like the homeless veterans we sometimes encounter. He was different. Could you check a name for me? Walter Kane. Probably enlisted sometime in the 70s or even earlier. When Jason ended the call, he glanced out the narrow window. Kane hadn't gone far. He sat silently on a bench just outside the gate. He wasn't making a scene. He simply waited, with a patience that felt timeless and heavy. Jason muttered an old saying his father had drilled into him. When everyone turns away, only your conscience remains. He said it again, slower this time, and felt the meaning settle deep inside. The story of what happened at the gate spread through the Camp Brighton morning shift, faster than spilled coffee. In the cafeteria, Annie Delgado, who'd been working behind the counter for over 30 years, overheard a group of guards laughing as they grabbed their morning pick-me UPS. What did he look like? Annie asked casually, wiping her hands on her apron. Old guy, one of them replied between laughs. Maybe 80. Stood there stiff as a damn lamppost. Had an ID from 99. Can you believe that? Annie's smile vanished. Did he wear a brown jacket? Quiet. Didn't argue. Yeah, the guard said, puzzled now. You know him. Annie nodded slowly. The memory wrapped around her like an old familiar coat. I saw him once, back in 1989. There was a fire in the armory. 3 men were trapped inside. He just walked into the smoke and brought them all out, one after the other, like it was nothing. I never learned his name. But that face, I never forgot it. The guard raised an eyebrow, skepticism on his face. Come on, Annie. If that's true, he's a hero, someone muttered. Heroes don't get turned away at the gate. Annie shrugged, a small sad smile on her lips. I'm just telling you what I saw. If you don't believe me, ask Colonel Mitchell Grant. He was one of the men pulled out of that fire that night. As the morning went on, rumors spread like wildfire. A young communications officer, who had overheard Annie's story, snapped a grainy photo of Kane, still sitting calmly on the bench outside. She posted it to the base's internal message board with the headline, "Does anyone know this veteran? Turned away at the gate, but Annie says he saved lives during the 1989 depot fire." Replies flooded in almost immediately. Someone wrote, "Looks like the guy in that old photo in Colonel Grant's office." Another added, "My dad served in the 70s, said that might be Walter Kane. But I thought he died years ago." A third asked, "Wasn't Walter Kane the guy who got some secret medal in Vietnam?" Meanwhile, Jason Rivera sat tensely near the duty phone. 20 minutes after his call to the Pentagon, the phone rang sharply. Jason picked up immediately. "Private Rivera speaking. This is Colonel Samuel Hayes, Department of Historical Special Operations, Pentagon. I need to speak with the officer in charge at your post immediately. Put me on speaker." Jason's heart raced as he waved over Lieutenant Brooks. "Sir, call from the Pentagon, they want to speak with you." Brooks straightened his uniform, confusion on his face, then picked up the phone. "This is Lieutenant Brooks." "Lieutenant, this is Colonel Samuel Hayes. Switch this call to speaker, now." Brooks obeyed. The small security room went silent as Hayes' voice filled the space. "The man you turned away is retired Colonel Walter E. Kane, former commander of Bravo's Special Operations Team. From 1971 to 1999. His clearance is still active under General Order 117A, regardless of the expiration date on his ID." Sergeant Daniel Ortiz, who had been casually leaning against the wall, snapped to attention. Lieutenant Brooks went pale. "Sir, we didn't know," Brooks stammered. Hayes cut him off. "Colonel Kane is attending the annual memorial ceremony. He has every right to be there. This man led the most successful evacuation unit in Vietnam, and later commanded the 1975 Cambodia POW rescue mission." A collective gasp filled the room. The Cambodia operation was legendary, though much of it was still classified. For decades, rumors circulated about a small team that rescued 28 American POWs from deep inside enemy territory without losing a single man. "A vehicle is already en route to your location," Hayes continued firmly. "I strongly recommend you treat Colonel Kane with the utmost respect until it arrives." As if on cue, a black military SUV pulled up to the gate. 3 high-ranking officers stepped out, moving with purpose and urgency, led by a decorated colonel, whose chest gleamed with rows of ribbons. "I'm Colonel Beckett. Where is Walter Kane?" he asked. Brooks pointed silently toward the bench. Without a word, Beckett marched to Kane, followed by the others. Jason watched through the window. As Beckett approached and saluted, Kane slowly stood, returning the salute with precision. They exchanged words, shook hands, and Kane handed Beckett a thick envelope from his jacket. 15 minutes later, they returned to the gate. This time, Lieutenant Brooks and Sergeant Ortiz stood at full attention. "These gentlemen are entering under my authority," Beckett announced, his tone brooking no argument. As they passed, Beckett paused and turned to the assembled security team. "For your information," he said coldly, "the ID card you mocked contains an embedded transmitter. Colonel Kane activates it once a year, on Veterans Day. So we know he's still out there. We monitor it deliberately." Brooks swallowed hard. "Sir, I had no idea." "No," Beckett replied sharply. "You didn't. You saw an old man with a faded ID, and made assumptions. This man led operations you'll never even be allowed to read about. He saved more American lives than anyone at this checkpoint ever will." Once they were out of sight, Jason turned to Brooks. "Sir, what just happened?" Brooks rubbed his face wearily. "We just insulted a living legend. That's what happened," Jason muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Cambodia rescue mission," he whispered. "That's like yelling at Rambo." Later that morning, Jason's phone rang again. It was his uncle. Bob Taylor's voice was tight. "Do you know who that was?" he asked urgently. "Walter Kane isn't just some retired officer. After Vietnam, he led the most classified evacuation unit in military history. His missions are still redacted to this day." Jason finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind all morning. Then why did someone like him just walk away? Why didn't he say anything? There was a long pause before Bob answered. "Men like Kane don't need to prove anything. They know exactly who they are. That's what made them so effective. No ego, only the mission mattered." Throughout the day, bits and pieces of Kane's story spread through unofficial channels. Since retiring, he had lived quietly in a small Nevada town. He refused interviews, declined awards, and never sought attention. This was the first time in decades. He had even attempted to step onto a military base. The envelope he carried wasn't a symbol. It held personal letters. He had written every year to the families of the soldiers who had died under his command. Their names were engraved on the memorial wall inside Camp Brighton. For 40 years he had written to them, without ever mailing the letters. Until today. "I don't know about you," one soldier posted, "but that part hit me hard. If it moved you too, type respect." By noon, Camp Brighton buzzed with a kind of energy. that hadn't been felt in years. When the base commander declared an emergency protocol, the order was clear. Prepare an honor welcome for Colonel Walter Kane. The news spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers who had been performing mundane duties were suddenly ordered to line up along the main road, forming a corridor of respect. In record time, an honor guard was assembled. Dress uniforms were pulled from lockers, quickly pressed, medals fastened. Meanwhile, the memorial site, Kane's intended destination, was readied for an extraordinary guest. Lieutenant Kevin Brooks, still haunted by the humiliation that morning, stood at full attention as the escort arrived. Kane, walking calmly with the officers, wore the same simple civilian clothes. He had politely declined the offer of a formal uniform. But even in worn khakis and a modest jacket, he radiated an undeniable authority that made everyone around him stand straighter without thinking. As Kane approached the gate once more, a remarkable scene unfolded. Every single soldier in sight stood at attention, saluting with the precision normally reserved for four-star generals. Kane returned their salute with the grace of decades of service. His weathered hand moved with the flawless muscle memory of a lifetime in command. Across the base, internal communication channels lit up. Urgent, all units be advised. Colonel Walter E. Kane, retired, is on base for a memorial event. Honor protocol is in full effect. Pentagon has been notified. This concerns a highly decorated Special Ops commander. Show maximum respect. Media blackout on Kane's presence remains in place. Veterans with ties to Camp Brighton were in a frenzy. Kane's alive, one post read. The Walter Kane. I thought he died years ago. Another said. My father served under him in 1973. Said Kane was the best officer he ever knew. He never left a man behind. Never. The base's digital announcement board soon filled with messages from aging veterans who had once fought beside him. I was a radio operator, trapped in Vietnam. One story read. Kane led the evacuation, 72 hours with no sleep. Never complained once. He kept every one of us alive until we made it out. Another wrote. In 76, he turned down a Silver Star. Said he didn't need a medal for doing his duty. He said the success of the mission was reward enough. Everywhere, the same respect echoed. There had never been another like him. Later that afternoon, after Lieutenant Brooks had been quietly relieved of his checkpoint duty, he went to find Kane. He found him standing silently before the memorial wall, his eyes fixed on the names listed under the Southeast Asia operations. Brooks stepped forward slowly, shame evident in every hesitant movement. Colonel Kane, sir. Brooks began, his voice barely audible. I want to apologize for how I treated you this morning. I was disrespectful and prejudiced. Kane turned to face him. His expression was unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice firm and deep. You did your duty, Lieutenant. No, sir, Brooks replied, now standing a little straighter. I may have followed regulations, but I failed in my true duty. My duty to protect this base, yes, but also to honor those who served. I failed you. Kane studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, the fault isn't yours. It's in the way you've been taught to see people today. Brooks furrowed his brow slightly, uncertain of his meaning. Kane continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience. In my time, we were taught to judge a man by his character, not just by his decorations. Somewhere along the way, that was lost. That simple truth struck Brooks harder than any formal reprimand. He had spent so much time clinging to rules and protocol. He had forgotten to see the human being in front of him. By early afternoon, the base commander had called an impromptu assembly. In the main auditorium, over 200 personnel, mostly new recruits, who had never heard of Walter Kane before today, filled the seats. High-ranking officers lined the walls in silence, standing in solemn respect. The base commander, a two-star general who had flown in, immediately upon hearing that Kane was present, stepped to the podium. "Today," he began, "we are honored by an unexpected guest, Colonel Walter Kane, a man whose service record remains partially classified to this day. Colonel Kane has agreed to share a few words with our youngest generation of soldiers." A quiet murmur rippled through the room as Kane slowly made his way to the stage. Despite the passing years, his tall figure was still imposing. As he reached the podium, he paused, letting his gaze drift silently over the assembled faces. It was a moment that felt almost sacred. "I didn't come here for recognition," he said softly, but clearly enough for all to hear. In the hushed auditorium, "I came to honor the men who never made it home, whose names are engraved on the wall outside." He fell silent again, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. He let the words settle. "You asked me to speak to these young recruits. I only have one thing to say. Honor is not found in a uniform, a rank, or an ID badge. Honor reveals itself in how you act when no one is watching. It's about keeping promises, especially when it's hardest to do so." The room remained completely silent as Kane's words sank deep. "I never spoke publicly about my service, not because it was classified, but because the mission was what mattered, not the men who carried it out. Those I served with understood that. We didn't need recognition. We had each other's respect. And that was enough." His gaze drifted to the back of the room, to where Lieutenant Brooks stood stiffly among the crowd. "The young officer at the gate this morning," Kane said, "did what he thought was right, based on what he saw. I don't blame him. But I ask all of you to remember, the most important truths aren't always written on the surface." After his speech, Kane moved slowly through the sea of officers and soldiers who had lined up to shake his hand. Sergeant Danielle Ortiz stepped forward, visibly moved. "Sir, my father served at Camp Bay in '67. Ortiz said, her voice unsteady. "He used to tell me a Colonel Kane organized the evacuation that saved his unit. Was that you?" Kane looked closely at her face, searching for a familiar trace. "What's your father's name?" he asked. "Carlos Lopez, sir. 5th Infantry." Kane nodded slowly. A faint smile touched his lips. "I remember that operation. Your father was brave. He helped carry 2 wounded men to the extraction point." Ortiz's eyes widened in amazement. "He never told me that," she murmured. Kane shrugged slightly. "The bravest ones rarely do," he said simply. Later that afternoon, an unexpected gesture came from the base's security team. After consulting with his superiors, Lieutenant Brooks ordered the creation of a small bronze plaque to be mounted at the checkpoint, where Kane had been turned away only hours earlier. The inscription read, "Kane Gate, in honor of quiet courage." Later, as Kane prepared to depart Camp Brighton, a high-ranking intelligence officer, flown in directly from Washington, approached him discreetly. "Colonel," the officer said softly, "there's something you should know. The letters you wrote over the years to the families, they were delivered. Every single one." Kane looked genuinely surprised for the first time that day. "How?" he asked. "I never sent them." "No, you didn't," the officer replied. "But you wrote each name and address on the envelope. Each year, after you activated your signal, we quietly checked to see if you were still with us. Our agents collected the letters and made sure they reached the families. We made sure," the officer added softly. Walter Kane stood completely still, as the weight of those words settled in him. 4 decades, he had written letters every year to the families of the men who died under his command, believing it was a private act of remembrance, a duty he owed them. Now, learning that those messages had truly reached their families, visibly moved him. The Sullivan family in Oregon? The Williams family in Georgia? He asked quietly. The officer nodded. All of them. Every year. Some families have kept every letter you ever wrote. As the sun slowly set over Camp Brighton, Kane returned once more to the memorial wall. His rough fingers gently traced the engraved names. A small group of officers stood at a respectful distance, watching in silence, as the living legend paid tribute to his fallen brothers. As Kane finally turned to leave, he said a few quiet words to the base commander, words that would later be inscribed on the new bronze plaque at the renamed Kane Gate. "I only came to visit those I couldn't save." That evening, the legend of Colonel Walter Kane echoed through every corridor of Camp Brighton, a silent lesson in humility, duty, and enduring honor. As Kane was escorted off the base with full honors, Lieutenant Kevin Brooks stood at attention, saluting at the gate. From the passing vehicle, Kane returned the salute of the young officer with calm and dignified precision. In that silent moment, something passed between them, a deeper understanding that neither time nor circumstance could ever erase. A truth: honor, once earned, can never be diminished. When in your life did justice come late, but sweet? In the following months, Walter Kane returned to his quiet life. In the small town in Nevada he had long called home, he declined every interview offer, and gently refused the wave of medals and honors offered by grateful military organizations. And yet, his story lived on. The incident with the call to the Pentagon, as it soon became known in military circles, evolved into a powerful teaching example. Without ever mentioning Kane's name, his story was used in officer schools across the country as a case study, an example of the difference between rigid regulations and true leadership. True to his promise, Lieutenant Brooks, now resolute and focused, carried the lesson forward. He oversaw the placement of the bronze memorial plaque at the checkpoint. Its simple inscription read, "Honor endures long after ID cards expire." Kane's expired military ID card, the one that had sparked so much misunderstanding, was placed into the historical archive at Camp Brighton. No long descriptions or classified details accompanied it. Just a small placard that read, "This faded piece of plastic once belonged to one of the most highly decorated commanders in modern special operations history." It ended with a single line, "An expired ID, but an honor that never fades." On the next Veterans Day, a black SUV once again pulled into Kane's modest driveway. This time, he was not surprised. A quiet tradition had been born, one that would continue for the rest of his days. A small, loyal gesture of recognition for his place in the military family he had served so faithfully. Jason Rivera, the young private whose call had set everything in motion, was later accepted into officer candidate school, with a personal recommendation from a Pentagon colonel. In his graduation speech, Jason shared the lesson that had forever changed how he viewed military service. Never judge a warrior by the date on a card. Judge him by the honor in his actions. Years later, when asked about that unforgettable Veterans Day, Lieutenant Brooks, by then Captain Brooks, paused in reflection. Some badges don't need to be worn, he said quietly. They're already etched in blood and courage. And he often reminded the young officers under his command, sometimes, the one you dismiss without a second thought is the very person who once protected you from things you'll never fully understand. As for Colonel Walter Kane, he continued writing his annual letters, now with the peaceful knowledge that they were reaching the families they were meant for. In his final letter, found neatly on his desk, after he passed away at the age of 89, he had written, "Honor does not fade. It only needs one person to remember. Justice may arrive late, but it never fails. Don't give up when you're doing what's right. When did you stand firm while the world stood against you? Tell your story. Subscribe to Heart Trails to see how truth and justice still prevail."